Most countries build institutions. Some build economies. A few build empires. China built a civilization. And that difference is what unsettled the West. For the last 2 centuries, Western powers have tried to understand China using the same framework they use for everyone else. Is it authoritarian or democratic? Capitalist or socialist? Rising or declining? Ally or rival? But those questions assume something simple, that China is just another nation competing inside the same global system. What if that assumption is wrong? What if China isn't merely participating in the modern world order, but carrying something far older into it? The West built a world of nation-states. Borders drawn on maps, governments elected or overthrown. Economies measured quarter by quarter. Power justified through ideology. China built continuity. To understand why that mattered, and why it generated fear, we need to step back from headlines and look at structure. The modern Western model of power is relatively young. The nation-state, formalized after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, was built on sovereignty, territorial boundaries, and political consent. A country exists because its people, in theory, agree to be governed. Governments rise and fall. Systems are redesigned. Revolutions reset the board. History, in this model, is something you move beyond. China followed a different logic. Long before modern Europe unified into nation-states, China had already fused dozens of warring kingdoms into a centralized civilizational core. Dynasties rose and collapsed, but the cultural spine endured. Language endured. Administrative structure endured. The expectation of unity endured. In Europe, Rome fell and never came back. Its territories fragmented into separate identities that eventually became France, Germany, Spain, Italy. In China, fragmentation was temporary. Collapse was not the end of the story. It was a phase inside it. This pattern repeated for 2,000 years. The Qin unified China. The Han consolidated it. The Tang expanded it. The Song refined it. The Ming restored it. The Qing inherited it. Different rulers. Same civilizational operating system. That operating system was built on 3 pillars: written continuity, bureaucratic governance, and civilizational memory. First, the written language. China's logographic script created a bridge across centuries. A scholar separated by a millennium could still recognize the characters used by his ancestors. The pronunciation might shift. The dialect might change. But the written symbols carried the past forward. This created something unusual: historical accessibility. The past was not mythologized beyond reach. It was readable. In Europe, language fragmentation mirrored political fragmentation. Old English became Middle English, then Modern English. Latin splintered into Romance languages. The continuity of Rome required translation. In China, continuity required interpretation, not reinvention. Second, bureaucracy. For over 1,000 years, China selected administrators through competitive examinations. The imperial examination system tested knowledge of Confucian texts, governance principles, and literary composition. Passing meant entry into a meritocratic civil service that operated beyond individual rulers. Emperors came and went. The bureaucracy remained. This meant power did not rest solely in a charismatic leader or aristocratic bloodline. It rested in a system that trained officials to preserve order, collect taxes, manage infrastructure, and resolve disputes. The system survived Mongol conquest. It survived dynastic collapse. It survived peasant rebellion. The structure mattered more than the individual. Third, memory. China internalized the concept of the dynastic cycle: order, prosperity, corruption, collapse, renewal. The mandate of heaven was not simply theology. It was political theory. A ruler retained legitimacy as long as stability was maintained. When disorder spread, legitimacy dissolved. The goal was never permanent revolution. It was restoration. Unity was not an aspiration. It was an expectation. Now consider how this appeared to Western observers in the 19th and 20th centuries. European empires operated under the assumption that modernization required Westernization. industrialization, constitutionalism, liberal democracy. These were seen not as cultural variations, but as evolutionary steps. When China resisted wholesale adoption of Western political forms, it was labeled backward. When it reasserted centralized authority after periods of chaos, it was labeled authoritarian. When it prioritized stability over liberal pluralism, it was labeled repressive. But from China's internal logic, these moves were not deviations from progress. They were acts of preservation. The fear did not emerge because China was weak. It emerged because China proved it could modernize without dissolving its civilizational core. Japan modernized by borrowing Western institutions. Many post-colonial states adopted Western constitutional frameworks. The Soviet Union attempted ideological replacement. China absorbed technology, capital, and global trade, but it did not abandon its administrative DNA. It joined global institutions while strengthening internal centralization. It embraced markets while maintaining political hierarchy. It spoke the language of sovereignty while thinking in civilizational continuity. To a West accustomed to ideological conversion, this was unsettling, because it suggested something radical. Modernity did not require Westernization, and a civilization that could integrate global systems without surrendering its identity would be difficult to reshape, contain, or predict. That is where the anxiety began. Not in tanks, not in missiles, in durability. The West built a global order designed around nations that could be pressured through sanctions, persuaded through incentives, or transformed through internal reform movements. China was not merely another state inside that order. It was a civilization adapting to it. And civilizations, unlike governments, do not change course every election cycle. They endure. To understand why that endurance mattered and why it continues to unsettle Western assumptions, we need to look at how China entered the modern world and what it chose to keep when everything around it was collapsing. If this made you question the framework you've been using, stay with me. The next chapter begins not with rise, but with humiliation. When China entered the modern world in the 19th century, it did not enter by choice. It was forced in. European gunboats arrived not as curious visitors, but as enforcers of a new global system. The Opium Wars were not simply military defeats. They were structural shocks. Ports were opened. Unequal treaties were signed. Sovereignty was compromised. For a civilization accustomed to seeing itself as the center of its own world, this was more than humiliation. It was disorientation. For the first time in centuries, China confronted a reality in which its historical continuity did not guarantee dominance. Western industrial power, naval mobility, and financial networks created leverage that China could not ignore. The West interpreted this moment as proof of civilizational superiority. China interpreted it as systemic failure. That distinction matters. In the Western narrative, modernization required transformation into something fundamentally different. Political liberalization, competitive elections, pluralistic institutions, these were framed as prerequisites for strength. In China's internal narrative, the priority was not transformation, it was restoration. The late Qing reformers understood that military weakness stemmed from technological lag. They began adopting Western engineering, shipbuilding, and educational methods. Railways were constructed. Telegraph lines were installed. Foreign language schools opened. But even as these reforms unfolded, the civilizational core remained the reference point. Confucian ethics were not discarded. The bureaucratic hierarchy was not dismantled overnight. The expectation of unity was not abandoned. When revolution finally came in 1911 and the Qing dynasty collapsed, the event was dramatic. A 2,000-year imperial structure formally ended. But what replaced it? Fragmentation, warlordism, regional militarization, political experimentation. From the Western perspective, this looked like the birth pains of a normal nation-state. From the Chinese perspective, it looked like disorder. And disorder, within the dynastic cycle framework, was not progress. It was a warning. The decades that followed, civil war, foreign invasion, economic collapse, reinforced a lesson that had been embedded for centuries. Unity was survival. When the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, it did not present itself as the beginning of something entirely new. It framed itself as the end of chaos. The narrative was clear. China had been divided. China had been humiliated. China had been exploited. Now China was unified again. That message resonated not because it was revolutionary, but because it aligned with a civilizational memory stretching back through multiple cycles of rise and collapse. To the West, the new Chinese state was communist. To many Chinese citizens, it was restorative. This divergence in interpretation widened over the following decades. Western political thought emphasized individual rights, separation of powers, and electoral accountability. Stability was important, but liberty was foundational. Chinese political thought emphasized order, hierarchy, and long-term coordination. Liberty existed within structure, not outside it. These were not minor policy differences. They were different hierarchies of value. During the Cold War, this contrast was overshadowed by ideological rivalry between capitalism and communism. China's alignment with Marxist doctrine allowed Western observers to categorize it neatly within a familiar framework. But as economic reforms began in the late 1970s under Deng Xiaoping, that framework began to crack. China opened markets. It welcomed foreign investment. It joined global trade institutions. It integrated into supply chains that stretched across continents. By conventional Western theory, economic liberalization would eventually produce political liberalization. Market forces would generate middle-class demands for pluralism. Global integration would standardize governance models. It did not happen. China grew wealthier, but it did not dissolve its centralized political structure. It adopted capitalism's tools without surrendering bureaucratic control. It encouraged private enterprise while reinforcing party authority. From within China's civilizational logic, this was consistent. Tools can change. The operating system does not. From within Western expectations, it was unsettling. Because it suggested that modernization was not a one-way path toward convergence. A country could industrialize, innovate, urbanize, and digitize, and still preserve a governance model rooted in historical continuity rather than electoral turnover. As China's economic scale expanded, so did its global presence. Infrastructure projects stretched across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Manufacturing capacity reconfigured global supply chains. Technological firms competed in telecommunications, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy. The concern in Western capitals was not only about competition, it was about precedent. If China's model proved sustainable, it would challenge a central assumption of the modern Western project, that liberal democracy represented the final stage of political evolution. The fear was not of invasion, it was of divergence. A civilization state demonstrating that prosperity, stability, and long-term planning could coexist without Western-style political pluralism complicated decades of ideological confidence. This is why debates about China often feel existential rather than transactional. Tariffs and trade balances are surface issues. Beneath them lies a deeper question. What is the foundation of legitimate power in the modern world? Is it consent expressed through ballots? Or continuity preserved through centralized coordination? The West and China answer differently, and neither believes it is experimenting. Each believes it is defending something fundamental. The tension, then, is not simply geopolitical, it is civilizational. To see why that tension intensified in the 21st century, we have to examine how China began articulating its identity outwardly, not just internally, and how that articulation reshaped global perceptions. Because once a civilization becomes confident enough to project its model beyond its borders, the reaction is no longer confusion. It is calculation. As China's economy expanded and its confidence grew, its leaders began speaking less like managers of a developing country and more like stewards of a long civilizational project. The language shifted. No longer focused solely on growth targets and poverty reduction, official rhetoric emphasized rejuvenation, national renewal, and historical destiny. The phrase, The great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation became a central theme. This was not accidental branding. It was a civilizational signal. Rejuvenation implies restoration of something that once existed. It suggests a return to historical stature rather than the creation of a new identity. In other words, China was not climbing toward modernity in the Western sense. It was recovering from a period of abnormal weakness. From this perspective, the 19th and early 20th centuries were not the start of a new era. They were an interruption. This framing altered how China approached global influence. Where Western powers often export values through institutions, aid conditions, and political pressure, China prioritized infrastructure, trade corridors, and economic integration. Ports, railways, power plants, digital networks. The Belt and Road Initiative was not marketed as ideological alignment. It was presented as connectivity. This approach mirrored ancient patterns of civilizational expansion. Historically, Chinese dynasties extended influence not by spreading political doctrine, but by building trade routes, tribute systems, and administrative linkages. Economic gravity drew regions inward. Order followed commerce. Once again, the operating system was running. To Western strategists accustomed to alliances built on shared ideology, this model was difficult to categorize. China was not asking countries to adopt its political system. It was embedding itself in their economic foundations. Loans funded highways. Construction firms built ports. Telecommunications companies installed digital infrastructure. Supply chains reoriented. Dependence quietly formed. This did not resemble traditional imperial conquest, but it did resemble civilizational influence. The concern was not that China would impose communism abroad. The concern was that it would reshape global flows of trade, data, and capital in ways that centered its own system. Influence without conversion. Power without occupation. From Beijing's perspective, this was natural. Civilizations historically radiate outward as they stabilize internally. Prosperity creates attraction. Networks expand. Peripheries integrate. From Western perspectives shaped by 20th century ideological conflict, it looked like strategic encroachment. The same infrastructure that facilitated development could also enable leverage. Ports could host commercial shipping or naval vessels. Digital networks could transmit data or surveillance. Trade relationships could foster growth or dependence. Every connection carried dual meaning. And because China's long-term planning horizon extended decades rather than election cycles, its moves felt patient, cumulative, and difficult to counter quickly. This patience itself generated unease. Western policy systems are built around short-term accountability. Leaders respond to quarterly economic data, annual budgets, and immediate public opinion. Strategies shift with administrations. China's system, by contrast, allow continuity of vision. 5-year plans nested within longer-term development goals. Leadership transitions managed internally. Projects measured in decades. When Western analysts spoke about strategic competition, they often imagined symmetrical rivalry between nation-states playing by similar rules. But China was not merely competing. It was positioning itself within a historical arc. In this arc, technological leadership, industrial capacity, and infrastructural connectivity were not temporary advantages. They were civilizational assets. Assets designed to endure. The fear intensified as China advanced into high-tech sectors once dominated by Western firms. Artificial intelligence research expanded. Semiconductor manufacturing ambitions accelerated. Renewable energy production surged. What unsettled Western observers was not just economic displacement. It was strategic self-sufficiency. For 2 centuries, global power had rested on industrial choke points controlled by Western nations, finance, shipping, insurance, advanced manufacturing, reserve currencies, and technological standards. China's trajectory aimed to reduce vulnerability to each of these. Alternative payment systems, domestic technology ecosystems, supply chain localization, resource diversification, not isolation, resilience. From a civilizational viewpoint, resilience is survival, dependence is fragility, and fragility invites disruption. This is why Western responses increasingly shifted from engagement to containment. Tariffs were imposed. Technology exports were restricted. Investment screenings tightened. Alliances were reframed around strategic competition. The language of partnership gave way to the language of rivalry. Yet these measures were reactive. They addressed immediate imbalances without altering the deeper structural shift underway. Because the source of anxiety was not a single policy or company, it was momentum. Momentum built across infrastructure, technology, finance, and demographics. Momentum sustained by centralized coordination. Momentum aligned with a historical narrative of restoration. When a nation-state competes, its ambitions can be negotiated, redirected, or slowed. When a civilization reasserts itself, it moves with a different kind of inevitability, not rushing, not improvising, advancing. This is the point where fear becomes strategic, not fear of immediate collapse or conflict, but fear of long-term displacement. Of waking up decades later to discover that the center of gravity has shifted quietly, gradually, and permanently. To fully understand why this shift feels so profound, we need to examine how differently China and the West define success itself, and why those definitions shape every policy decision they make. Because what one side sees as competition, the other sees as continuity. And those are not the same game. At the heart of the tension between China and the West lies a simple but profound difference in what each side believes a society is ultimately for. In much of the Western world, the highest political goal is individual freedom. Systems are designed to limit centralized power, protect personal rights, and allow constant correction through elections, courts, and public debate. Change is expected. Disruption is tolerated. Even instability is sometimes accepted as the price of liberty. In China's civilizational tradition, the highest political goal is continuity. Stability is not a temporary condition. It is the foundation of prosperity, social harmony, and survival itself. Disorder is not seen as creative destruction. It is seen as suffering. Where the West often celebrates upheaval as progress, China historically views upheaval as breakdown. This difference shapes everything. When Western societies debate policy, they often prioritize fairness, representation, and individual choice, even if decisions are inefficient. When Chinese governance evaluates policy, it prioritizes long-term coordination, economic resilience, and social order, even if personal freedoms are constrained. These are not simply cultural preferences. They are civilizational instincts formed by centuries of experience. Europe's political evolution emerged from fragmented kingdoms competing with one another, where limiting centralized power was necessary to prevent tyranny. China's political evolution emerged from cycles of unification and collapse, where restoring order was essential to ending chaos. Each system was shaped by what threatened survival most. For the West, unchecked rulers. For China, fragmentation. Once this is understood, many modern conflicts become clearer. Western leaders speak about democracy promotion as a universal good. Chinese leaders hear instability. Western media frames centralized control as oppression. Chinese history remembers centralized coordination as salvation. Western policymakers worry about authoritarianism spreading. Chinese policymakers worry about disorder spreading. They are responding to different historical fears. This does not mean one system is morally superior. It means they are built on different priorities. The civilization state model that China embodies produces impressive continuity. It enables long-term planning, massive infrastructure projects, and coordinated economic strategy. It allows rapid mobilization in crises. It resists fragmentation, but it also concentrates power. It limits dissent. It prioritizes collective stability over individual autonomy. The nation-state democracies of the West protect freedoms, encourage innovation through open debate, and allow peaceful political change. But they also struggle with polarization, policy whiplash, short-term decision-making, and declining institutional trust. Each system carries trade-offs. What unsettles the West is not simply that China is powerful. It is that China represents a different answer to the question of how a modern society should be organized. For generations, Western political thought assumed that all nations would eventually converge toward liberal democracy as they develop economically. That assumption underpinned foreign policy, globalization strategies, and international institutions. China's trajectory challenges it. Here is a civilization that modernized without adopting Western political structures. Here is a society that integrated into global markets without surrendering centralized authority. Here is a model that prioritizes continuity over constant reinvention. And it appears, at least for now, to be working. This is the deeper source of unease. Not military confrontation, not economic rivalry alone, but the possibility that history does not move in a single direction, that multiple modernities can exist, that Western political evolution is not the final stage of human governance. When China speaks about a community of shared future for mankind, it is not simply diplomatic language. It reflects a worldview in which civilizations coexist, influence one another, and adapt without necessarily converging into one system. The West often hears this as strategic rhetoric. China hears it as historical reality. For thousands of years, East Asia functioned as a civilizational network centered on Chinese culture, trade, and administration. Influence flowed without direct conquest. Order emerged through hierarchy, ritual, and economic interdependence. What is unfolding today resembles that ancient pattern more than the imperial domination familiar to Western history. And that unfamiliarity fuels fear, because it cannot be easily categorized. It cannot be neatly confronted. It cannot be forced into ideological boxes built for 20th century conflicts. China is not trying to remake the world in its image. It is trying to secure its civilization's continuity within it. And in doing so, it is quietly reshaping global structures around trade, infrastructure, technology, and governance norms. The West fears losing primacy. China focuses on avoiding fragmentation. Both are acting rationally within their historical frameworks. Once you see this, the headlines read differently. Trade wars become structural repositioning. Technology restrictions become resilience building. Diplomatic tensions become civilizational friction. This is not a temporary rivalry between governments. It is an encounter between two deeply different ways of organizing human society. One built on constant reinvention. The other built on enduring continuity. China does not see itself as rising into a new world order. It sees itself returning to a historical norm after an unusual period of weakness. The West does not see itself as declining. It sees itself defending the system it built. Neither side is playing a short game. They are playing on different time scales. Understanding this does not require agreeing with China's model. It requires recognizing that it is not simply another version of the West. China is not a nation trying to become a civilization. It is a civilization that learned how to operate as a modern nation. And that is why it unsettles the assumptions of a world built around nation-states. The West built a system expecting convergence. China built a civilization expecting endurance. As global power continues to shift, the question is no longer whether China will change to resemble the West. The question is whether the world will learn to navigate a future where different civilizational models coexist. Because history suggests that civilizations do not disappear easily. They adapt. They absorb. They endure. And the civilization China built has been doing exactly that for over 2,000 years. If this changed the way you think about global power and China's role in the modern world, take a moment to explore the next video. Thanks for watching.